In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 9, where last time we developed the long-run Phillips curve. This time we'll develop the short-run Phillips curve, consider movements and shifts of the short-run Phillips curve, then conclude with a summary. With all this in mind, beginning with our preliminaries, before moving on to discussing the stability of business cycles, we have been developing the Phillips curve model, which will allow us to explicitly keep track of the unemployment rate and inflation rate in an economy. And in terms of this model, it will have two components to consider, given that there's a short-run and long-run relationship between our two variables of interest. Where thus far we have developed the long-run component, now we would like to develop the short-run component, in which the short-run component is captured by the short-run Phillips curve, which represents the negative short-run relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation rate. We're taking a look at our graph below. We have the inflation rate on the vertical axis and the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis. And in terms of the short-run Phillips curve itself, we see that it is downward sloping to indicate the negative short-run relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation rate, in that if the unemployment rate is increasing, then this is going to be met by decreases in the inflation rate, while the opposite is true. If there's increases in the inflation rate, then this is going to be met by decreases in the unemployment rate. Secondly, a second observation that we could make is that we see that the short-run Phillips curve is nonlinear, and this is to capture that nonlinear relationship that we also saw when examining our annual U.S. data set. So now that we've covered the short-run Phillips curve, what we'd like to do is to consider how there is movement along the short-run Phillips curve, as well as how there are shifts of the short-run Phillips curve in itself. Beginning with movements, given that the short-run Phillips curve captures the negative relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation rate in the short run, then movement is going to be based upon demand shocks encountered in the economy. Given that when we were going through shocks, we observed that demand shocks were capable of generating negative movement between the unemployment rate with the inflation rate. In that if there was a negative demand shock, we saw that the unemployment rate would increase while the inflation rate would decrease, while if there was a positive demand shock, we saw that the inflation rate would increase while the unemployment rate would decrease. We're modeling this in terms of our Phillips curve. Let us consider both cases, in that if there was a negative demand shock, and turning to our ADAS model and assuming a long-run equilibrium at point A, the negative demand shock occurs, corresponding to a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve, where after adjustment and the economy goes to the short-run equilibrium at point B, we see that an unemployment gap exists, so there's unemployment concerns, and we see that the price level has decreased, so that there's disinflation or deflation that has occurred. So, given that the negative demand shock generates an increase in unemployment and a decrease in the inflation rate, turning to our Phillips curve model and considering only the short-run Phillips curve, if the economy was initially at point A at the unemployment rate U0 and at the inflation rate pi0, then to represent this increase in the unemployment rate and the decrease in the inflation rate, then this corresponds to rightward movement on the horizontal axis and downward movement on the vertical axis, or in other words, rightward movement along the short-run Phillips curve till we get to point B, where we're at the new unemployment rate U1, which we see is strictly greater than U0, and at the new inflation rate pi1, given that it's below pi0, we see that this is a decrease in inflation, capturing what we saw in our ADAS model. Now, considering the case for a positive demand shock, we mentioned that there'd be an inflationary gap, so there would be a decrease in the unemployment rate and an increase in inflation, where in terms of the ADAS model, what that means is if the economy was initially in a long-run equilibrium state, a positive AD shock occurs, then after adjustment to the short-run equilibrium point B, we see that there's an inflationary gap. The economy is producing above potential real GDP. By producing more, this is going to decrease unemployment. And in terms of the price level, since P1 is above the targeted price level P star, then this means that there's inflation going on. So then the way that we model this in our short-run Phillips curve is that if the economy was initially at point A at the unemployment rate U0 and at the inflation rate pi0, well, given that the positive demand shock occurred, in order to have a decrease in the unemployment rate, this is leftward movement on the horizontal axis, and in terms of having that increase in the inflation rate, this is upward movement in terms of the vertical axis, or in other words, this is leftward movement along the short-run Phillips curve until we reach point B, in which the new unemployment rate is U1, which we see is strictly less than U0 as required, and in terms of the inflation rate, we see that it's at pi 1, which is strictly above pi naught, indicating that increase in the inflation rate. So now that we've seen that movements along the short-run Phillips curve will be based upon demand shocks, we now want to turn our attention towards shifts of the short-run Phillips curve, where this will be based upon supply shocks, given that we've seen that supply shocks will correspond to the unemployment rate moving with the inflation rate. Where to see how this occurs in terms of a negative supply shock as well as a positive supply shock, let us consider each case individually. We're starting with the negative supply shock. We've seen that if the economy was in a long-run equilibrium state and a negative supply shock occurred, after adjustment there would be an unemployment gap in which there's unemployment problems, in which there would also be an increase in the price level corresponding to inflation, or that stagflation is present in this economy. So then with unemployment increasing and the inflation rate increasing, how do we model this in terms of our short-run Phillips curve, given that it represents the negative short-run relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation rate? Well, if the economy was initially at point A, at the unemployment rate U0, and at the inflation rate pi 0, we need to be able to demonstrate an increase in unemployment in terms of its rate, as well as an increase in the inflation rate, where movement to the left or the right of the short-run Phillips curve will not generate this, but instead the entire curve will shift, where in this case, since the unemployment rate is increasing, this will correspond to a rightward shift, and this will also be some leftward movement in terms of the short-run Phillips curve until we reach point B, indicating also an increase in the inflation rate, where at point B, the unemployment rate is U1, so an increase from U0, and at point B, the inflation rate is pi 1, which is strictly above pi 0, indicating that inflation has also occurred. So given that there's an increase in unemployment rate and inflation rate, this represents stagflation. Where overall, in terms of this rightward shift, though, of the short-run Phillips curve, at any point, if we were to hold the inflation rate constant, say at pi 0, at point A, we would see that if we went along to the short-run Phillips curve 1 in purple, we would see that to maintain the same inflation rate, we would have to have an increased unemployment rate. So this also demonstrates that the trade-off between the unemployment rate and inflation rate in the economy has also gotten worse as well. So now to consider the case of a positive supply shock, we have seen that if an economy is in a long-run equilibrium at point A and experiences a positive supply shock, then after adjustment, there would be an inflationary gap to indicate a decrease in unemployment, and there'd be a reduction in the price level, indicating that disinflation or deflation has occurred. So a positive supply shock corresponds to a decrease in the unemployment rate and a decrease in inflation, where turning to our short-run Phillips curve, if the economy was initially at point A at the unemployment rate U0 and at the inflation rate pi 0, then to represent this decrease in the unemployment rate, that is leftward movement horizontally, and the decrease in the inflation rate, that is downward movement on the vertical axis, then this means that the Phillips curve itself, the short-run variant, would have to shift to the left, and that there would be some rightward movement until we reached point B, where at point B, we would be at a U1 amount of unemployment in terms of its rate, which we see is strictly less than U0, and in terms of the inflation rate, we would be at pi 1, which we see is strictly below pi 0, indicating a decrease in inflation as well. And lastly, with respect to the shift, if we were to hold the inflation rate constant, say at pi 0, and we were to compare the unemployment rate between our two curves, we would see that at pi 0, the unemployment rate at short-run Phillips curve 1 in purple is lower than the unemployment rate at point A on our original short-run Phillips curve, which indicates that a leftward shift of the short-run Phillips curve also improves the trade-off between the unemployment rate and inflation rate in an economy. So, to summarize what we've found then, is that the Phillips curve model will explicitly allow us to keep track of the unemployment rate and inflation rate in an economy, where there will be two components to consider given the short-run and long-run relationship the two variables have with one another, in which the short-run Phillips curve represents the short-run relationship between the two variables, where movement will be based upon demand shocks occurring in the economy, where shifts of the curve will be based upon supply shocks. So given this, where we'll pick up next time is we will examine the Phillips curve model in its entirety.